From my perspective, I think the phrasing that needs to be used is actually about the cost of carbon, rather than simply looking at things in relation to the idea of a carbon tax, because it is about the cost of carbon, and the fact is that carbon has immense costs. The costs of carbon are manifested in the climate change, in all of those impacts of climate change affecting many of the most vulnerable people in the world. I know that I've met people from Malawi, from Bangladesh and others who are already experiencing the costs of carbon. And that is the cost. And the fact is that the cost of carbon, the cost in terms of the environment, the cost on vulnerable people, has not been reflected in the price of carbon, from my perspective. It has simply not been reflected. And that is because the costs and the damages have been socialised, in that the costs that people are carrying in terms of the damage that carbon has done is being paid for either by individuals, sometimes in terms of their health, sometimes in terms of their lives, but also by in terms of governments. The idea that the government will deal with the flooding risk, the government will engage in, governments worldwide will deal with the mop-up, they'll deal with the displacement of large numbers of persons, with land that no longer becomes arable, with all of those consequences. All of those costs have not featured in the discussion about fossil fuels as if they are solely a commodity and have been traded in the commodity market. And that's for me why I kind of fundamentally come to this point of, I do believe that the cost of carbon the price of carbon has to reflect more of the cost of carbon. So the price must reflect the cost of carbon, from my perspective. And I think then the question for us as legislators and as a committee is to say, when we have a realistic cost on carbon, how do we ensure that the most vulnerable in society, all of them, that everyone in society is not affected by that realistic price being put on carbon, that we don't have the most vulnerable persons affected? And that's why sometimes I don't like all of the narrative around that this is a kind of a stick to poke people into behavioural change. I believe it's a lot more serious than that. It's a lot bigger of an issue than that. I don't believe it's simply a matter of, certain taxes that get introduced as a penalty for somebody to kind of as a slap on the wrist. It's a matter of the price being very serious. In that regard, I believe we do need to ensure that all of those revenues that are coming from that going back into the public sector, that they are used to take serious action in respect of climate change. And I note, I do regret, I think it's sometimes the case with summer consultations, that there is a very small number of consultations, but I do note that a majority seem to have favoured the idea of sustainable transport infrastructure or of household energy improvements. And in a moment, Mr. Kenny, I might come and ask you to comment, but I'll link it to another question, in terms of people realising that these are socialised and common risks. I have a concern in relation to the dividend argument, and I'd like the perspectives of Vincent de Paul and of ESRI in relation to that. As I understand it, the dividend proposal would only go to those who have managed to reduce their household energy bill. And reducing of your household energy bill is something which is not necessarily easy to do if you were in a local authority housing. And this is that issue which was mentioned around the fact of the retrofitting of local authority housing. There's also the question, if you are a private renter, if you are renting, perhaps receiving rental supplement or HAP supplement from the government, you are not necessarily in a position, will the dividend or the rate go to the owner of the house? Will the cost come? Where does that cost come? Where does that dividend come? And that is a very serious concern that I have in relation to those issues. I think I agree that fuel allowance in itself and fuel poverty are not, I think fuel poverty needs to be considered. Fuel allowance is not the only mechanism. I'd be interested from ESRI perspective, if they believe we should look at poverty, are they talking about consistent poverty or risk of poverty? My concern would be that consistent poverty may end up being too high a bar. The issue in relation to planning, it's been touched on, and I do understand the concern that's there. I do think nonetheless, of course, that community impact assessment, environmental impact assessment are important in relation to sustainable energy and in terms of building that credibility and public support. And I imagine the fact of having community engagement, community ownership and community-led projects facilitates that kind of social and environmental impact assessment being more successful. I am concerned about the two things. First of all, the idea of this larger, what you call about the larger sets of offers, what you call the large gate, that issue, in terms of what that has done in terms of small scale and community, and even the timing or predictability of small scale communities. You know, is there a potential to have effectively something that looks more like a predictable, consistent, rolling mechanism around grid offers at particular scales, that, you know, communities can plan knowing that this is the likely grid offer, rather than saying we're going to be entering some giant competitive tendering mechanism that's going to be huge and we have no idea what will happen.